Hi, I'm Bruce Walton from Road Safety Analysis, and this is the fifth in a series of 10 bite-sized demonstrations of my favourite things which MAST can do. In this clip, I'm going to demonstrate to you how to use the average distance from home measure in MAST to give you an insight into how the casualty profile of different types of road risk can vary dramatically in different areas with very important implications for intervention planning. I want to look at how far people are away from where they live at the time when they suffer an injury in contrasting areas of the country. And I'm going to do this by opening a casualties blank report, and I'm going to set my report up by thinking about the factors that are most likely to influence how far people are away from home. One obvious one is whether they are travelling on a busy urban road or whether they're travelling on a rural road through a more countrified area. Another thing is whether they are in a vehicle at the time when they're injured or whether they're a pedestrian at the time when they're injured. Other things that you might think of which might influence this are whether they were on a trunk road, whether the road class of the road that they were travelling on, the vehicle type that they were travelling in, and all kinds of other things that you could add into this analysis. But those are the two I'm going to use in this example. So I'm going to remove my crash date dimension from the rows tab, and instead I'm going to add the very useful road, urban or rural dimension, which uses the same definition of urban and rural roads that the Department for Transport use in Road Casualties Great Britain. I'll add that in there. And then on the columns, I'm going to add the other thing I'm going to analyse by, which is casualty class, which differentiates between vehicle users and pedestrian casualties. Now we've got a tiny handful of not knowns. They're not really relevant for what we're doing, so I'm just going to filter them out. There we are. I'll turn off the not knowns in the road, urban or rural dimension. Back onto the columns tab. Do the same thing for casualty class. So I've got all casualties where I know whether they were in a vehicle or not, and I know whether they were on an urban or rural road. Now those totals give me the grand total number of casualties of that kind that there were, but how far away were those people from their home base at the time when they were injured? This gives me an insight about the likelihood that people are being injured in or near their own communities and in or near their own authority areas. Well, to do this, I'm going to go to something that you've probably ignored in MAST up till now, the measures dimension, which appears on the columns tab automatically in all reports. Measures just means the numbers. Never remove the measures dimension, by the way, because if you do, all the numbers will disappear from your report. But unlike other dimensions, if I click on the filter arrow at the right-hand end of the measures dimension, I get a list of different types of numbers that I can show in my report. For example, in this report, by default, I'm showing number of casualties, but I've got another measure, shown by the little ruler symbol here, called casualty average distance from home. This simply takes the location where the crash occurred, compared to the centre point of the casualty's postcode, and calculates the distance from one to another as the crow flies. If I turn on casualty average distance from home, I could turn casualties off if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave it on because it'll give me an interesting comparison. Click on OK, and there we have it. So, vehicle users on rural roads were on average 27.5 kilometres from home at the time they were injured. By comparison, pedestrian casualties on urban roads were only about 6.5 kilometres from home at the time they were injured. The exact figures aren't important, but by comparison between them, you can get something which is meaningful. So we're getting that pedestrian casualties in urban areas are 3 or 4 times closer to home than vehicle users in rural areas. But let's have a look at how dramatically this changes depending on what part of the country we look at. Let's suppose I wanted to look at a relatively rural and relatively isolated part of the country. I'm going to go onto the filter tab, and I'm going to add the crash location dimension to allow me to filter by where the crash occurred. There we are. And I'm going to take as an example the Devon and Cornwall Police Force area. If I filter by Devon and Cornwall Police, we're going to see a significant difference in the way that the figures stack up. So just to remind ourselves where we were, the average urban pedestrian was closer to home than the average vehicle user pedestrian by a factor of about 50% there, and the average rural vehicle user was very much further away from home than the average urban vehicle user. Those are the national norms. Let's have a look at how Devon and Cornwall differs from this national picture. And when I click on OK, you can see that casualties occurring in the Devon and Cornwall Police Force area are significantly different. Pedestrians in urban areas are on average further away from home than vehicle users in urban areas. And that is very different to the national norm. Perhaps that's telling us something about the kind of person who's more likely to be a pedestrian in Devon and Cornwall, far more likely to be someone who's come from further afield, perhaps a holidaymaker. Similarly, you can see that the difference between people who are injured in rural roads and people who are injured in vehicles on urban roads is much more marked. So again, you have people coming from significantly further afield to drive along the rural roads of Devon and Cornwall than is the case compared to the country as a whole. Just to show how stark that difference can be, if I compare those average distances from home in Devon and Cornwall with a very different area of the country. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this very useful unselect all to clear my existing selection. And instead of Devon and Cornwall Police, I'm going to choose the West Midlands Police Force area. So we're looking at a busy urban area right in the middle of the country with a lot of trunk roads running through it. And when I select that, you can see the difference. Urban pedestrians in the West Midlands Force area are likely to be much closer to home than is the annual average, and far, far closer to home than your typical pedestrian in Devon and Cornwall. This makes a very big difference if you were targeting an intervention based on that group. So that's an introduction to the average distance from home dimension that you can add to your measures in a MAST report. I've done it for casualties here, but exactly the same thing works for drivers involved in crashes if you were in a vehicle report, and full details of how that's calculated and some examples of national norm figures that you might like to compare the figures in your local area to are all to be found in the MAST wiki. In the next bite-sized clip, I'm going to demonstrate another of my favourite things that you can do with MAST. I'm going to look at how you can calculate risk percentages relative to overall totals and relative to population in a way similar to we did in our recent child casualty risk report.